Well, howdy everybody. I'm tuning in from Cornell's Arnott Teaching Research Forest, and Peter Smallage warned me that the internet connection here is good, but maybe not great for a webinar. So at moments I may sound a little bit faded. Thank you, Steve, for inviting me to join the webinar today to give you a quick background on our farm. We're in Watkins Glen, York, in the heart of the Finger Lakes region. We're currently grazing about 400 contiguous acres and leasing some additional hay ground. We started in the early 2000s raising mostly sheep and goats, including some fiber animals, and shortly afterwards brought the first beef cattle to the farm too. Our farm was a dairy farm until the mid-80s, and we've grown slowly to about 100 brood cows today. We've been in the animal welfare approved program for about 8 years. I'm temporarily out of that program, but will likely return in the future. So much of what I'm going to show you is falls within the standards that we have to follow for the animal welfare approved program. My background with silvopasturing started in the early 90s. Steve just showed you another slide a few minutes ago. I had the good fortune there to work with large ranchers, many of whom had forestry backgrounds as well. And by the time I showed up there in the early 90s, they had already been doing large afforestations in central Argentina for almost 20 years. And I was brought there to teach their gauchos, those are the Argentine cowboys, how to be loggers. And it's probably fair to say that I learned a lot more from them than they probably did from me. Turns out that logging is hard work, and many of them, I think, just preferred to be cowboys instead of loggers. But nonetheless, it was a valuable experience for me as a young idealistic forester to see that you could integrate grazing and timber production together on the same land. And by doing so, they were definitely multiplying the benefits that they were getting from their ranches. And many of these people continue to be close friends. In fact, my wife and I have had a ranch there in the same area now for almost 25 years since we were married. And there have been numerous studies done to show that they're producing more pounds of beef per acre with the trees growing on this land than without the trees. And at the same time, they've been able to solve a number of other environmental and social issues, such as a big uptick in the rural employment opportunities by planting and caring for and harvesting and utilizing this forest resource, as well as the ecosystem services that the trees provide to their ranches. So when we returned in the early 2000s to upstate New York, this is what the understory conditions throughout much of our farm's 100 or so acres of woods look like. And we had problematic plants that were both native, like the beech brush in the left-hand photo, as well as non-native plants that were causing issues. The upper right-hand picture is a honeysuckle thicket, one of our more common invasive shrubs. The lower right-hand photo is a multiflora rose thicket. And regardless of whether we're talking about native or non-native plants, none of these understory conditions was very desirable from our perspective. These were woods that were not pleasant to walk in or hunt in or cut firewood in, and probably not very desirable from a wildlife habitat standpoint as well. A question that often comes up when talking to audiences about silvopasturing is, well, how do you protect the young trees? growing in these wooded areas that you're developing into silvopasture. When you look at the typical farm woodlot or old farm plantation, and you have this ugly understory of plants. This is a picture from our farm, probably going back a dozen years now, and every so-called invasive plant, forest invasive plant that grows in upstate New York can be seen in this picture. There's multiflora rose, there's European buckthorn, Oriental bittersweet, privet. It's a picture that was obviously taken in early fall, but if it was spring, you'd probably see garlic mustard in there. So when our understory conditions look like this, there really aren't any desirable young trees in there that we need to worry about. And also, regeneration is something that is, from a forestry perspective, we really don't need to concern ourselves with until we're closer to the end of the life cycle of those woods and need to be thinking about replacing mature trees that may not be there for decades longer with offspring that can form the next generation of forest. So when we're starting with overgrown understory of invasive shrubs or these small diameter suppressed trees that Steve was talking about 10 minutes ago, we need to somehow level the playing field so that then the livestock can come in and take over and become our workforce and try to transition these understories into more desirable forage plants, and as well as perhaps woody plants. One of the strategies that's been most effective on our farm is to use a variety of different types of mowing machines. This one that you can see in the pictures called a Fecon. It has like a giant stump grinding head on the front, but there's many different styles and models of these types of mowing machines. And what these machines do quite effectively is take a lot of undesirable trees and shrubs and turn it into mulch. If we go in and we just cut the trees down or cut the bad invasive shrubs down, we still have all that debris on the ground, which then becomes an impediment for the livestock to be able to go in there and control what wants to grow back. So we can go and kill bad plants in many different ways, or bad bushes, bad trees. But if we create this void and let sunlight in, more plants are going to grow back, and it's not going to be all just good plants. It's going to be a mix of desirable plants and undesirable plants. Consequently, livestock becomes a very important piece of this transition to silvopasture, where they go out and happily work for food, controlling to an extent what wants to come rushing back into this disturbed area. We found early on that sheep and goats were certainly enjoyable for us to work with, and they're well known for their propensity to eat brush, but they are very selective eaters, and they're always going to go for the best stuff first. It's like us walking up to the buffet bar and going right for the prime rib and the crab legs versus the iceberg lettuce. So the one consideration that's needed to really use livestock effectively to manage the vegetative response is to keep them in relatively high densities, so there's a bit more of a feeding frenzy mentality and a little less selectivity. However, over time, we realized that beef cattle were, even though beef cattle didn't quite have the same preference for eating brush as the sheep and goats, these were larger animals that could create a lot of impact. And Livestock Impact becomes our main tool for managing silvopasture areas, because unlike open pasture areas where we can go in and readily brush hog or spray or even reseed areas if they become too weedy or too brushy, in silvopasture areas we have a lot of trees and stumps and shrubs and other woody objects in the way. So Livestock Impact is pretty much the main tool that we have to control that vegetation, manage that vegetation. That picture there is, it's from a different direction, but it's basically the same exact spot as the previous photo taken several years later, as we've started to shift the understory vegetation to more grasses and forbs than woody plants. This picture here is one of our locust and black walnut plantations on the farm that when we started grazing it in the early 2000s, this was head-high multiflora rose and honeysuckle and other invasive shrubs that had come in since we had planted the trees. We planted the trees, we took care of them for a couple of years, then we kind of walked away from it. I was out of the country for years and came back, and the trees were there, but so were a lot of other things. And through this combination of a little bit of mowing, a little bit of spraying, but mostly intensive rotational grazing, we were able to rehabilitate it into what you see in this picture there. So developing a existing wooded area into silvopasture is this process of reallocating sunlight to our best trees by taking out the less desirable trees. Think of them as the weed trees that are competing with our best trees. But Steve had pointed out throughout his presentation that we're managing multiple layers. So one of the main differences between managing a woods for silvopasture versus managing it simply for, say, healthy, productive trees is that we have to thin all the way to the ground level. If all we're trying to do is grow our larger trees that are in the main canopy, give them more space and sunlight to grow, then we only need to be thinking about removing competing trees that are at the same height in that main canopy. But as you can see in the photo in the upper left-hand corner, there's also a lot of these smaller trees and lower strata vegetation, and the hemlock and the hop hornbeam trees and the beech brush stems that you can see in that relatively unthinned woods there are intercepting a lot of valuable sunlight. So we have done, we did a large commercial timber harvest in 2015 to remove a lot of these second and third and fourth best trees from our woods. And if you look at the picture in the bottom there, you can see that even though these are trees, if you look carefully, you see some trees that have blue paint marks on it. And they look like nice straight sound trees, but for the most part, they're smaller in diameter and they're not as good as the better trees that they're competing with. When you look at them in the log pile, you see all the hollow spots and decay in the butt ends of those logs, and you realize that what you were really doing was trading firewood quality trees for growing forage, and that you really didn't lose that much. These are trees that are smaller and of lower quality for a reason. They're sooner or later they're probably going to succumb to natural competition anyhow, and all we're doing is speeding up the natural selection and utilizing those trees today so that we can again get more sunlight on the ground, start growing higher quality edible plants for our livestock. You can see the top of a tree there in the background. Managing the residual debris that we call slash is very important. So we look for logging methods that can minimize the amount of residual that we're leaving behind on the ground. The next step, though, is to manage with higher densities than you might typically see in grazing operations. This is an older picture of our farm, but each of those purple lines represents an internal fence. Many of those areas, especially the silvopasture areas along the top, have since been further subdivided. So we can put the whole herd on just an acre or two at a time and create densities upwards of a couple 100,000, even 250,000 pounds per acre. That's about as high as we've been able to reasonably achieve in silvopasture areas yet. But the other part of this creating higher density is that we're putting all the animals in a small area for a short period of time. That means that the rest of the farm is being rested and allowed to recover. And that's where we avoid a lot of the issues that were associated with woodland grazing in the past. We don't have the animals in there continuously compacting soil and stressing the trees. We've come to appreciate the potential for bale grazing. So we're grazing about 8 months on either growing pastures or stockpiled pastures, and then in early January we switch over to rotationally grazing round bales. So we put out in the same paddocks, and we try to place these round bales in the little remnant patches of brush. You can see here where some round bales were fed on top of multiflora rows, and the cows have done a pretty thorough job of thrashing that. And we can achieve densities here of upwards of 1 million to 1.5 million pounds per acre, plus a kind of a longer residency because the cows stand for hours at a time around the round bale. Plus it inoculates that site with some fertility and grass seed. That's the same location the following grazing season. You can see how nicely it's recovered. And doing this once doesn't usually kill the bad plants. You have to be persistent over the course of perhaps a number of years. And then just the last couple slides, I could talk for a long time about the many reasons that we do silvopasturing, the benefits, but these are areas that we try to hold for our mid to late summer grazing during the so-called dog days of summer. Cooler and cooler conditions for our animals, plus a lot of high quality green forage when our cool season pastures are usually looking pretty brown and senesced. And we think that these diverse silvopasture diets provide a lot of health benefits, nutritional benefits for our animals. And Steve talked about the two directions from which we can approach silvopasturing. We're also putting trees into our pastures as well. That's a whole story unto itself. So that's the last slide.
Thanks so much, Brett.
I hope the sound came through okay.
Yeah, there was a little cutting in and out of the end, but still able to hear on my end at least. So if folks have any questions or weren't able to hear something, feel free to chat. I'll hang out for a few minutes here just to wrap up. And if there's any questions that folks want to ask, two ways to ask questions. You can type something in the chat box. If you don't see the chat box, then you got to find that little menu, usually at the top of your screen, and open it up. You can also feel free to unmute yourself. If you find the participant panel, you can, or on that black toolbar, there's a little microphone. You can actually click on the mic, and if you have a microphone connected, you can just ask a question if you want. So any questions from folks, feel free to go ahead. If you're going to take off, thanks for coming. I'll follow up with an email and invite you to join the other webinars that we'll be presenting. Hopefully give you some good insight and some good ideas to get started. But I think both Brett and I can say there's just so much more to get into. So appreciate your time, Brett. And this is just the beginning of the conversation that's been going on for many years.
So Pat typed in a question, why not let the goats take down the rose or the honeysuckles? So first thing we have to do is get the plants down to a height where the animals can then take over. But sheep and goats will, sure, they'll browse brush. They'll probably even heavily defoliate it if given enough opportunity. But just munching on bad invasive shrubs alone, like honeysuckle or multiflora rose, usually does not stress the plant sufficiently to really kill it or knock it back very much. So it's a combination of things like uh, stressing the plants through defoliation, stressing the plants through trampling, stressing the plants by maybe mowing them off, but also trying to get a herbaceous sod established, which then can help uh, suppress and outcompete the invasive woody plants.
Yeah, and I'll just say to Pat's question as well that we've had a little bit of success with our sheep, which are Katahdins, which are similar. They're very goat-like in there. Sheep are a wide range. They have a wide range of preferences for different breeds on how much they'll get into it. But if we keep our sheep in a relatively small area during the winter and they get through their hay, they often will go and start stripping, honeysuckle and things to a degree. But I agree with Brett that it's certainly not going to be the complete strategy, and definitely in the summer the best we get is usually defoliation. And then there's always this question of, as Brett mentioned, since preferential browsing is really a key concept, you have to leave them in there long enough so that the best option for them is stripping bark. And the danger in that is you can leave them in there too long, and then they're also doing damage to the foliage the forages that are trying to recover. So it's a timing game. Like I said, in the winter, we've had the most success because animals are a little more bored in the winter, and so you can sometimes get a little more of that effort. But I think that a combination of animal impact and mechanical or other means are going to be necessary, all depending on the density of your area you're trying to work.
Just a few more questions. So Michael asked about how are we keeping the sheep in with electric mesh or tape. We managed our sheep and goats with high tensile fence, but it didn't give us the ability to corral them in at high enough densities to really do what we wanted to do. Now, you, Steve, you manage yours with electronet, and you're able to get a little bit more of that targeted browsing and even girdling with your sheep.
Yeah, we're definitely. I think with the smaller ruminants, I mean the big benefit to larger animals, like cows, as Brett mentioned, is the amount of weight you can bring into a space, and also that you can manage them with really little fencing, single strand in many cases. But we definitely, with the sheep, need something more robust, and the netting, the roles of netting and learning how to move that efficiently is a learning curve for sure. But once you get it going and prepare the space for that netting, it can be a really great management tool. And I think that the advent of so many different forms of of electric fence that are portable and relatively easy to set up is a really key development just in the last decade or 15 years that allows for a lot more of this stuff to work. So it's definitely an important piece of technology. And I would say for sheep and goats, the netting is probably going to be the way to go.
Yeah, I agree. We have a lot of neat tools today for doing a better job grazing, and that's one of the things that's changed in just the past few decades. We're no longer talking about old woodlot grazing with three strands of barbed wire stapled to the trees. We can go out there and use tools like electronet and wide impedance fence chargers today and solar fence chargers to control our animals much better and control their impact as well. Sonia had asked how many acres of trees did we cut on the 100 acres for 100 cattle, sheep, and goats. So our home farm is about 200 acres. Half of that acreage was wooded, and we've planted an additional roughly 25 acres over the years. But we did the commercial timber harvest on all 100 acres in 2015. And that reminds me of an important point I'd like to make, and that is that we don't want to get ahead of ourselves. If we're going to go in and thin wooded areas, we keep in mind that what I said about our livestock being our main tool or our workforce for controlling the vegetative response, once we let sunlight in and reach the ground. So you want to be careful if you have a small flock or a small herd and you go in and thin out a really big area, you could have that blow up into worse plants than what you just spent money and time controlling. So you need to uh, synchronize this with the growth of your herd or flock so that you don't have 10 sheep and you go in and thin 100 acres, and then 5 years down the road you wonder why it blew up into head high invasive shrubs and blackberry and plants like that. I also want to answer Chris's question quickly because it's an important one, and one that I think also gave woodland grazing of the past a bad name, and that is issues with degrade and defect in our very valuable hardwood trees. So silvopasturing is something that's been long practiced in other parts of the world and regions like parts of the western U.S. and the southeast, where they're primarily coniferous forests. And if you take, say, southern yellow pine plantation, like our ranch in Argentina, and you have a pine tree that's worth $2, and maybe the cows, you don't do a great job with your rotational grazing, and the cows might damage that tree. The tree goes from being worth $2 to maybe worth $1.80. When you do that with a high value hardwood tree like an oak or a maple or a cherry tree, the difference there could be you take a $200 tree and now turn it into a very low value, um, almost firewood quality tree. So the again, I put up a slide there. It said that silvopasturing is synonymous with intensive rotational grazing. So animals are in any given part of your silvopasture system for a very short period of time with a long rest period in between. And that's how we avoid a lot of the issues, such as soil compaction, damage to the root system, mineralization, which is it's not well understood, but probably has a lot to do with root compaction and damage around the root collar of the tree. So, um, on our farm, animals might be on any given acre of silvopasture 3 days a year for a day at a time with months in between.
Great. And one more question from Chris. If the goal is to grow stave quality white oak, what are the species you recommend as trainers in the design utilizing cattle? There's some research out there which I can share about using black locust as a nurse tree or a trainer tree. I think there's some potential there. I haven't seen it specifically with oak, but with walnut was the research. And I'm happy to connect with you, Chris, on that. Brett, do you have any? I know you planted locust and walnut together initially. I don't know if you have any thoughts to Chris's question there.
Yep. And so I would emphasize diversity. If you're trying to grow stave quality white oak, that assumes that the site quality is pretty good. White oak doesn't want a really poorly drained soil, and you're probably not going to grow stave quality white oak on a really infertile, say, sandy, droughty site either. So you're starting with a decent site quality, and that means that you can probably grow a fairly broad range of other companion trees. Companion trees in a plantation are often called nurse trees, and I would think of trees that are relatively easy and cost effective to establish, like black locust, in that if you're going to thin them out gradually to focus on your primary crop tree like white oak or black walnut, then trees like black locust that you can thin out when they're younger at smaller diameters and utilize them for effective products like fence posts. That the more you can recover products from those trees that you planted, the better the economics will look.
Great. Well, I want to thank everybody for coming out for the webinar. Again, I'm going to save this recording and post it. It'll be on the book website by tomorrow morning. And if you're interested, if you go to that book website and look under events, you'll find the other webinars. And if you haven't registered already, you can do that and I'll send you the link. So everybody have a great afternoon. Thanks again, Brett. And we'll talk again soon. Take care, everybody.